This is the All Aussie Rules Football Podcast, and it's round 2 of the AFL 2025 season. Today we're previewing all 8 matches. Stick around and enjoy. Welcome on in, everybody, to the All Aussie Rules Football Podcast. This is episode 15 of season 2025. And we've got the round 2 preview coming your way. There's 8 matches this weekend. We're going to be checking them all out in today's episode. After we're finished with that, we're going to jump into my tips for the weekend, as well as the power rankings after round 1. Every team has now officially played. We've got our power rankings. If you haven't checked it out already, there was already a podcast episode that went live earlier this week on all the normal platforms of YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. That was reviewing all 9 matches from round 1, so go check that out. We're going to jump into all the matches. Before we do that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, don't forget to follow. Leave a comment. Let me know who you think. Which game is going to be game of the round this weekend? That's a good question. It's a complicated one because I don't know if there's a standout game at the moment. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, follow along. I don't know if it's follow or subscribe, but do whatever. Hit the like button, all those things. All the interactions help out. Don't forget to check out the socials as well. We're pumping out content on Twitter, on Instagram, not on Facebook too much, so don't worry about that one. But definitely go to Twitter/Instagram or Blue Sky, whatever your favourite form is, or of course the good old-fashioned TikTok is going alright as well. So let's jump into it. Football is here for round 2 on Thursday night. It's Carlton Hawthorn at the MCG, 7:30 kickoff local time. It's going to be an interesting one. This one, a few weeks ago, this looked like it was probably built up as game of the round. Looked like a cracker. Carlton have started the season poorly though, and Hawthorn look like they're going all right. They're 2 from 2, so all of a sudden maybe not looking as good of a game as it was, but there's still hopes that maybe it will end up being a good game. It's an important game, that's for sure, especially mainly for Carlton. Hawthorn won't want to drop this one, obviously, but it's a big game for Carlton. I'm going to be at this game as well, so I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to be at quite a few games this weekend, and this is the first one, and teams have been announced for this one. So Charlie Curnow makes his return. He's coming in for Francis Evans for Carlton. That's a massive in, obviously. A fully fit Charlie Curnow is what Carlton need desperately after last weekend. It also just gives them that extra option forward, where they almost looked most dangerous last week when Jack Silvani went forward, and that was late in the game. He obviously played most of the game as a key backman, so Curnow coming in should allow Silvani to be back full-time, which he did a pretty decent job in the back line, to be honest. Curnow just adds that extra spine support, I guess. They're pretty good all the way through their spine. It's the rest of their team that maybe lacks a little bit of the class, but that will be a helpful improvement to their team, no doubt. For Hawthorn, they've made 2 changes this week. Giaff and Gunston both coming in. Out goes Sam Frost and Jack Scrimshaw. So Sam Frost has been sub 2 from 2 weeks, and now he's not playing this week. And Jack Scrimshaw, who is out with concussion/suspension. So he's out for 3 weeks, I believe. So we won't see him for a little bit. But that's all the team news. Jarman Impey is playing 200th game in this one, so I'll look forward to that for him. The history of these 2 teams is an interesting one, in all honesty. So we've got Hawthorn, who obviously previously hadn't been that great up until last season, late last season. The few years before that, they weren't great. Carlton have kind of been thereabouts for the last few years. You go back to 2022, they met in round 3, and it was a 1-point win to Carlton, so an absolute nail-biter there. 11-8, 74 to 11-7, 73. But since then, it's been completely different. Two very lopsided games, but one going one way and the other going the other. And it's been the away team, both times winning. So 2023 they met in round 16. Hawthorn lost this one by 60 points to Carlton. And then last year they met in round 22. So late in the season, Carlton weren't in the best form at this point, and Hawthorn were absolutely flying. And Hawthorn won it by 74 points. So absolutely smoked them. Make of that what you will, but it certainly is pointing all directions that Hawthorn should be too good in this one. Carlton's numbers across the board weren't too bad last week, but I mean they were playing Richmond, and in the end they lost the match. But their numbers around the ground were pretty decent. The game basically came down to the fact that Richmond turned it into a contested match, and Carlton just couldn't handle the pressure. I guess they fumbled a lot, they turned it over a lot, and made some silly mistakes, and that's what kind of cost them in that one. So Carlton, if they can keep it, they've always been a good contested team, but they're a good contested in the stoppage area, and then they're good at breaking it out and controlling the ball, especially when the other team has the ball. They're a very good intercept team. So that will play a role in this one. They obviously got off to a very good start last week. They were 41 points up, and they blew that. So their numbers look good on the stat sheet, I guess, but in the end, they didn't win the game. They made mistakes, and that cost them. Meanwhile, over on the other side of the fence, Hawthorn had 2 from 2. They beat Sydney round 1. It wasn't the most convincing win of all time, but they certainly looked good enough in that on the day there. And then probably ditto for last week against Essendon. Better team on the day, sure. Didn't smoke them, didn't smash them, but did enough to win by whatever it was, 26 points, I think, in the end. Take from that you'd probably expect Hawthorn to be the one to win this game. It's hard to see a world where Carlton turn around from what they did last week, but if you go back just to last weekend, Collingwood turned a terrible game in opening round into a really good win last weekend. So you don't want to read too much into round 1 games, opening round games, this early season games. A lot can change in a short amount of time, but based on what we've seen so far, Hawthorn is certainly looking like they're in a pretty good spot this season. I can't say the same for Carlton. So that's a wrap-up of Game 1. Hawthorn will go into this one massive. Favourites? Game 2 is Friday night, and this is the second game that I'll be going to. It's the Bulldogs versus Collingwood. Footscray for the weekend. In their 100-year celebration, having their 100-year celebration this Friday night. So if you're a Doggies fan, get down to the G Friday night and celebrate this one. It should be a cracker. Bulldogs looked pretty good last week. Collingwood, they certainly turned their season around last weekend. So it could be a good game. Obviously, we don't have teams announced for this one yet, being that it's not until Friday, so teams will be announced this time tomorrow, as of recording time. But by the time this is released and you're watching it, teams may already be out, or they'll probably be out in the next few hours. Collingwood will be going in favourites. I can't see that changing from here till kick-off time. Bulldogs facing quite a few injuries and players not playing. Collingwood almost getting back to full fitness. They've announced that Geordie De Goey will be back in this week, so that's, if he's fully fit, a massive in for them. A look at the history of these two teams, I guess. I personally think that the Bulldogs have probably had the wood over Collingwood over recent years, even though in 2023 Collingwood did win, but we'll get to that in a second. So last year they met in round 12, and Bulldogs won it by 18 points after trailing at three-quarter time. I think they were down by about a goal or so, and it looked like a close game, but in that in that last quarter, Collingwood just couldn't get it forward and couldn't score. Meanwhile, the Bulldogs finished full of running. 2023, Collingwood did win it by 12 points, but you've got to remember that is the year that Collingwood won the premiership and finished minor premiers, so they had a really good season that year, so it's not surprising that they beat the Doggies. And then you go back to 2022, and they met in round 9, and the Doggies won that one by 48 points. And if you go back, wind yourself back to those times, that is actually the game that I guess Collingwood lost, and then from then on, in 2022, they made a real big run in the back half of the season. So it was basically from round 10 onwards that Collingwood made their run and only lost a couple more games throughout the back half of that season. So that's basically the tale of the tape, I guess, for these two teams over the last few years. Looking at where they're sitting at the moment, Bulldogs played their first game last weekend against North Melbourne. It wasn't an overly convincing win, but they won by 16 points. They kind of led that. Well, I think they did lead the whole way by somewhere between like 5 and 20 points, pretty much for the whole match. Never really blew it out, never really got headed, but it was always kind of in their control, but also at the same time, North Melbourne were always within striking distance. I don't know what we can read from that game yet. Obviously, you want to see each team a couple times before you fully know where teams are at. North Melbourne, we do expect them to be better than they were last year, so maybe a 16-point win over them is pretty good effort to start the season. We'll have to wait and see. But as I said, Bulldogs are missing players. There's still no Treloar, there's still no Bontempelli, there's still no Jamara Ugle-Hagan, and there's probably more that I've missed off the top of my head, but even just those three, you're missing quite a bit of talent. Cody Waitman's another one, so while they do still have a solid enough midfield with Leber, Ed Richards, Joel Frazier was really good last week, Riley Sanders, they still have a pretty solid midfield, but they are missing some of the best players in the competition. Like Treloar's coming off the best season of his career. Bontempelli is, in my eyes, the best midfielder in the competition and has been for the last 2 seasons. So I just feel like that kind of puts them at a disadvantage here. Certainly puts them on the back foot. I wouldn't say it would write them off out of this game, though. On the other side of the fence, Collingwood have had one of the weirdest starts to a football season you ever see. Sorry about that. Nearly coughed up a lung. GWS, Collingwood played in opening round and got smacked. Collingwood got absolutely smacked. 52-point loss. In all honesty, it should have been pretty close at three-quarter time. Within a goal either way, I would have thought, but Collingwood's poor kicking had them out of it, and then GWS just absolutely ran over the top of them. Collingwood had no legs in that last quarter, and they were struggling to finish off quarters, and it was a little bit concerning for some. However, they came out on last weekend on Saturday night at the MCG against Port Adelaide and absolutely decimated them. They won it by 91 points in one of the biggest turnarounds you ever see in football. They went from 6 goals 16 in opening round to 21 goals 10 in round 1. They looked a completely different team. They controlled the match. They ran, they carried, they just did everything. They hunted in packs. They did everything they needed to do. So 2 very starkly different performances to start the season for Collingwood. Which one's the real Collingwood? I guess we may find out this weekend. They'll be hoping that they don't kind of do what the Bulldogs have done over the last couple of years and become a very inconsistent team where one week they will smash a team and then the week after they'll get smashed themselves. So that's probably Collingwood's biggest priority in this. And I guess the same kind of goes for the Bulldogs because their last few years have been very inconsistent. Their best is as good as anyone, but their worst is not very competitive at all and kind of shows up to more often than it should. I think that's everything from this game. It might be game of the round. It could also not be. I'm not convinced either way at the moment. I'm not confident in backing either team. I mean, I'll probably tip Collingwood, but at the same time, maybe I won't at all. Maybe I'll tip Bulldogs. It's a flip of the coin, I think, this one. We'll wait and see come the weekend. And my tips will be at the end. And now that I think about it, I think I did tip the Bulldogs, but we'll get to that shortly. We'll jump into Game 3. It's Saturday afternoon at the MCG. And it's the Dons versus the Crows in what actually is shaping up as a good game in my eyes. at the moment, the bookmakers have the Crows as, I won't say heavy favourites, but convincingly enough favourites for this one. It's almost the game I'm looking forward to the most, though. I think Bombers were pretty competitive last week against Hawthorn. Adelaide absolutely decimated St Kilda, but I don't have high hopes for the Saints. It's in Melbourne. I think most things are pointing towards this being a good game, in all honesty. So it's Saturday afternoon at the G. It'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. They've played some absolute crackers over the last few years, especially last year. They met twice last year. First up in round 6, it was at the Adelaide Oval. And if you can remember, there was a bit of a controversial finish. Sammy Draper laying down on the ball and not getting called for holding the ball, which was one of the more bizarre umpiring decisions I've seen, which was directly in front of goal, 30 metres out, which would have won the game for the Crows, but it didn't go that way, so the Bombers got the win. Having said that, the Bombers were probably the better team on the night. They just kicked really poorly in front of goal, and that's maybe the reason Adelaide was so close. But Adelaide got their revenge later in the year, back down, I think this one was at Marvel Stadium, so wasn't at the MCG, but the Crows did get their revenge. They won that one by 2 points in what was a high-scoring classic game. It was great to watch, and multiple times in that last quarter you thought both teams were going to win it. So that was round 19. You go back to 2023, they met in Melbourne and the Dons won it by 18 points. Neither team has really been that competitive over the recent years. Is this the year for both of them? Either of them? I guess we're going to find out a lot about both teams this weekend. I said going into last week that I was excited about the Adelaide St Kilda game because both teams have kind of been in similar position over the last 12 months. And it was a really important game for Adelaide, especially, that they needed to get their season off to a good start, and they did that. They went out and absolutely smoked St Kilda by 70 odd points. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they absolutely smoked them from start to finish. Their first quarter was outstanding, and they just kind of kept going from that point and looked really good, whereas St Kilda were, I don't know what to make of St Kilda. As I've said last week, don't take too much, don't make too many big decisions based on 1 week of football. You look at Collingwood, their week 1 to week 2 game was vastly different. However, the Crows did look really good, so that's what we can take from that. And as I said when we were talking about Hawthorn, Essendon actually looked pretty good last Friday night against the Hawks. I'm not convinced they're ready to compete or they're going to be a finals team this year, but I think they will be competitive. Certainly throughout this early part of the season, they're looking alright. Their pressure looks really good. They tackle hard. They bring the heat. And it's not going to be the same game for Adelaide as it was last week. St Kilda are, in my opinion, one of the more boring game styles in the competition, and which makes it even weirder that a team absolutely smacked them and kicked 21 goals on them. But I just don't see Essendon rolling over like that. It may be a high-scoring game, but if it is, Essendon will be scoring quite highly as well. Essendon like to play a pressure game. They like to play a pretty fast game. So if Adelaide are scoring high, which they quite possibly will in this game, you'll be seeing Essendon also scoring quite highly. There's going to be a couple changes on the Essendon side of the fence, a couple injuries. Jordan Ridley out, and also Cole Langford has a hammy, so there's a couple changes they have to make. It'll be interesting to see how that affects their team. Obviously, Cole Langford's been their main forward for the last few seasons, but it gives other people an opportunity. Edwards will come in. He looked good in the pre-season. Meanwhile, I don't think there's many issues over in Crowland. Their key forwards looked really good. Thilthorpe and Fogarty both looked really good up forward. Their smaller forwards, Ben Keys, looked great. Rankin was running right in that midfield with Saligo and Jordan Dawson. So This midfield matchup will be an interesting one because obviously Essendon have Zach Merritt, who's a gun. Caldwell coming off maybe one of his better games he's ever played. So the midfield battle should be a good one. How Essendon stop that Adelaide forward line might be where this game is won or lost, because the Adelaide forward line is looking very, very dangerous after last weekend, and I'm still not convinced on this Essendon backline being a great backline. If you get what I'm saying, I think I explained it. I think I know what I'm saying. So yeah, that's this game. It should be a cracker on Saturday afternoon. We then jump over to Adelaide Oval for Port Adelaide versus Richmond in what, going into it, I mean, the odds still say massively Port Adelaide here. Should be an absolute blowout, but we would have been more convinced of it being an absolute blowout before last weekend. Richmond came out, looked good. They brought some pressure with their young kids. They played pretty well, and they got a win. Meanwhile, Port Adelaide looked absolutely atrocious. They will be hoping that, well, their supporters will be hoping that they get the treatment that Collingwood got in a bit of a rev up and come out and completely turn their game around, because they can't play as bad as they did last weekend and not expect some consequences from it. You look at the history of these two teams. Obviously, the last year they met twice. Port Adelaide won them both. Richmond were pretty average team last year, so no surprise. Port didn't smash them either time. They won by 41 points in Adelaide and 30 points in Melbourne. So not dominations. They also won by 31 points in 2023 at Adelaide Oval. So the history says Port Adelaide, where both teams' lists are at, you'd say Port Adelaide, but you can't get too confident about Port Adelaide after what they dished up last week. Speaking of last week, it was a disaster against Collingwood. They lost it by 91 points, which I think I heard was their biggest loss under Ken Hinkley. They had some blowouts last year where they did get smashed. So it's not the end of the world, but you don't want to be dishing that one up again this weekend. So they'll be wanting to come out and really make a statement this weekend that they're not done. So I think we forget about last week for Port Adelaide, say, hey, it was a bad game. We're willing to ignore it, I guess, provided they come out and show us something this weekend. And then jumping across to Richmond, obviously they beat the Blues last week, which was a great game. It was one of the more entertaining matches I've almost ever watched. Carlton were 41 points up, and it was almost how many are they going to win this by. The commentators had given up on Richmond, probably rightly so, but Richmond just turned the game around. I think we've got to give some credit to the coaching decisions in the Richmond box, because the players enacted the changes, but I would imagine it came from the coach's box. In that first quarter and a half, every time coming out of the back line, they were kicking it just down the line to a contest, and Waitering would just towel them up. He took like 8 intercept marks for the match. He had like 14 intercepts for the game. He was just toweling them up. And then somewhere in that second quarter, they worked out that they can't just keep doing that, and they turned it into a move the ball forward at any cost game. And by doing that, they took Wiedering out of the game and started causing some of the other backmen to be making decisions and being the ones that have to pick up the loose ball or the hard ball, and they started to fumble, and then the pressure started building, and then all of a sudden Richmond were right on them, and the pressure just kept making the Blues make more and more mistakes. So Richmond got over the line. So I think well coached in game by the Tigers. I don't think we can expect to see them do the same again this week. They're not going to be able to bring that pressure every week. They're a mainly young team. Yeah, they do have some senior players, Nankervis, Taranto, plenty of others, but they have a lot of young players. A lot of players under 50 games. So until, I guess, we see them get a bit more experience, you can't really expect them to consistently be bringing that pressure. They'll bring it some weeks they might not. You kind of got to forgive them for that, and it's probably the away games where they're going to struggle the most to bring that pressure, where the crowd won't be quite as on their side. But we saw a good game from them in round one. So it's a good start. Don't expect that every week though. Jumping into the next game, we're Saturday night football. What do we make of this one, guys? It's St Kilda, Geelong, Marvel Stadium. Two teams that are in vastly different spots after last weekend. Geelong obviously going to go into this as favourites. I don't think there's any doubts there. They're clearly the informed team. They're probably one of the challengers for the premiership. St Kilda always, their pre-season hasn't been great. They have started poorly, so it's going to be tough for them. History of these two teams kind of looks alright for St Kilda. In fact, they've won 2 of their last 3. Both times in round 23 of the last 2 years they've won by 33 points, and then last year by 18. But they did meet early last season down at the Cattery from memory. That was round 1, both of their first game of the season. And St Kilda put up a fight. Both teams kicked poorly, but Geelong got over the line by 8 points. So St Kilda have a decent record against Geelong. But what we saw on the weekend is not convincing that this game will be that way. But don't write off St Kilda based on the history of these two teams. So last week, St Kilda went over to Adelaide and got pumped by Adelaide. They looked atrocious. They just had no set game style, really. Their midfield did okay at times. Their forward line didn't work that well. Their back line absolutely got pumped. Their talls got pumped. Their smalls got pumped. They were under pressure. They just couldn't control the game at all. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, Geelong looked absolutely outstanding from the opening siren to pretty much the end of the game. You take out about 15-20 minutes in that third quarter, and this game could have been well over a 100-point margin. The first half was huge by Geelong. Third quarter, Fremantle fought their way back and kind of looked like they were going to be competitive. They got it back to like 4 or 5 goals in that third quarter before Geelong absolutely turned it around. I think they kicked 10 in the last quarter to absolutely blow them out of the water. Geelong looked outstanding. Bailey Smith outstanding. In his first game for the Cats was best on ground. I think that's pretty obvious from most people thinking that. I don't know. Geelong obviously looked really good. This at Marvel Stadium does help St Kilda. The history between these two teams does help St Kilda. And as I said, don't get too caught up in one result. You want to see a trend of results before you overcommit to a decision on a team. But I just don't see a world where you can reasonably tip St Kilda with confidence, because last week was atrocious and obviously Geelong were really good. So I think that's the way we see this one going, at least for now. We move into the Sunday games, and the early one is another game that I'm not convinced is going to be a good one. It's, based on what we saw last week, could be a blowout. It's up at the Gabba. It's Brisbane hosting the Eagles. Brisbane will be going into this a very, very short-priced favourites, and I think that's completely justified in every essence of the word. These two teams have met just the once last year. It was over in the West, and the Lions won it by 13 points. That was late in the season. 2023, they met once. It was over at the Gabba, and Brisbane won it by 81 points. And then you go back the year before, they met at the Gabba again, and Brisbane won it by 75 points. And in all honesty, Brisbane are probably going as well as they were in either of those times, and West Coast are potentially going as bad as they were in both of those times. It doesn't read well for for Eagles. Sorry. You look at the last 3 times. All 3 times Brisbane have scored over 100. 2 out of those 3 times West Coast have kicked under 5 goals. So it's not reading great for the Eagles here. Last week, Brisbane, I think, got a highly underrated win. I don't think the pundits have been giving Brisbane as much credit for their win over Sydney as perhaps they deserve. I won't say it was an outstanding win, but when you take into perspective where Brisbane came into this game, obviously opening round was cancelled, so they missed out on that game. They missed quite a bit of training, certainly outdoor training, because Brisbane was underwater and their ground was underwater, so they missed a bit there. They went into this game, they had a late change. Charlie Cameron got injured and was a late change out of the lineup. And then the Swans kicked the first 4 goals, I think, or had 4 out of the first 5 or something along those lines. And then all of a sudden, Brisbane fought their way back into it. Obviously, the grand final rematch from last year. And Brisbane got it done. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the best win you ever see. It wasn't the best game you ever see. But what it was Brisbane getting the job done. Unlike what they did last year, early season, where they lost their first 3. They've done the reverse of that this year. So they've started well. They get a really good opportunity here to string 2 in a row to start their season. And if they start building up some confidence, they're going to be hard to beat, even without confidence. So if they start building that confidence up, we may start seeing a really big trend on who are going to be the competitive teams this season. And it's pretty much how I kind of saw them at the start of the year. The Brisbane Geelongs are going to be very tough, I think. Moving over to West Coast, this was a horrific day for them, in all honesty. Played against Gold Coast over in the West, and boy, oh boy, did they get pumped. It was 49 to 136 in the end. They kicked 2 of the first 3 goals, West Coast, and then from that point, it was 19 goals to 5. It was a bad day for them. No one looked great for West Coast. Their pressure wasn't great. Their ball use was pretty average. They couldn't get any territory. They've got to do something about their ruck, because they don't have their rucks. I don't think are good enough to be a standout one-out ruckman. So Oscar McInerney could be in for a good day here. It's just not a good look from what we've seen. As I've said, though, don't write teams off on one performance, but this is a bad sign for the Eagles, who obviously were bad last year, but were improving. This one, they didn't show that at all against Gold Coast. They had just 33 clearances for the game, had just 34 inside 50s for the game, so you're not going to win games of football doing that. And it was at home as well against Gold Coast, who didn't travel well last year, so it's really bad signs across the board for the Eagles, and in all honesty, I would not be surprised to see this being over 100 points in favour of the Lions. I could be completely wrong, but that's how I see this one. It's a tough call, tough ask for the Eagles over in at the Gabba. Jumping on to game number 7, we got Kangaroos, Melbourne. I was about to say MCG. It's at Marvel Stadium. Melbourne will be going into this as favourites. Obviously, if it was at the MCG, they'd probably be stronger favourites than they are, but they are still quite handily favourites in this one. They obviously have play each other usually just once or sometimes twice a year. Last year it was just once, and it was a absolute cracker, one that North Melbourne nearly stole the game in round 15. I think they'd only won 1 game at that point, maybe, and they nearly got their second. They lost it by 3 points, and due to some good accurate kicking from Demons, got them over the line that day. They kicked 11-4 to the Kangaroos 10-7. 2023 was Melbourne's wins both times they met, one of them by 90 points. So historically, Melbourne do pretty well. But being at Marvel Stadium, I think definitely helps Kangaroos in this. Melbourne are certainly, in my eyes, not as good team at Marvel as they are at the MCG. They don't get that many games there. You look at last week for both of these teams. North Melbourne looked pretty good against the Bulldogs. Like, they weren't great. They lost it by 16 points, but they were certainly competitive. They look like they're going to be pretty competitive against most teams, I think, this year. We don't know where the Bulldogs stand, but it was positive signs, at least, I think, for North Melbourne. They're not going to be... It's unlikely that they'll be a finals team this year, but they're a team that I could see winning 7 or 8 games quite easily. So they will win some games, and this might be one of those ones where they do win. It's not going to be an easy win for them, don't get me wrong, but it is one that they could be capable of. Meanwhile, Melbourne last week looked pretty good, in all honesty, against GWS. It was at a very wet MCG. Obviously, GWS had played the week before and looked outstanding. Melbourne took it right up to them. They were winning for a fair chunk of this one, certainly late. Keith for GWS kicked the match-winning goal with less than a minute to go. But up until that point, and even through that point, Melbourne looked pretty competitive and looked pretty good. A lot of people didn't give them much hope coming into this season, which I find a little surprising. They still have an outstanding lineup. Obviously, Max Gawn is an All-Australian ruckman multiple times, including last year, and you'd expect he'll be up there again somewhere. Petrarca, Oliver, their forward line's slowly getting better. Their back line is always pretty consistently strong, so I'm certainly not writing Melbourne's chances off this year just yet. I think they're certainly capable of playing finals, and if that's the case, they need to go to Marvel Stadium on Sunday and beat the Kangaroos. Doesn't matter how much they win by, but they need to win this one, I think. So both these teams coming off a loss round 1, so one of them will get their first win of the season in this one. Final game of the round. It is over in the West at the 6:10 kickoff time again. It's Fremantle v Sydney, Optus Stadium. Obviously 6:10 p.m. Australian Eastern Time, so that's going to be 3:10 p.m. for UWA folks. The Dockers going into this favourites, which I'm not convinced either way that either team should be favourite in this. We'll get to this season stuff in it shortly. They've had some interesting matchups. They met twice last year. We'll start with the second one. It was over in Sydney, and Fremantle gave Sydney their first loss in about 12 weeks, 14 weeks, something like that, when they won by a point. So that was an outstanding performance. And then you go to May 10, and Sydney did win that one over in Perth by 48 points. Don't read too much into that result, though. Fremantle kicked poorly in front of goals, kicked 4 goals 15, whereas Sydney were 13-9. But it was also a really tough week for Fremantle. One that we're not going to get into the specifics of here, but it was a really tough week emotionally for a lot of their players. So you kind of just write that game off and forget about it. And then 2023, they met in round 19 over in the West, and Sydney did win it by 29 points. So Sydney have won the last couple. They played Fremantle over at Optus. So that fills you, if you're a Sydney fan, with a little bit of confidence, I think, going into this game. I wouldn't say a heap amount of confidence, but a little bit. Neither team has won a game yet. These two teams are both winless going into this. Fremantle obviously 0-1. Sydney 0-2. For Fremantle, it was a bad loss. It was at HBA Stadium though, so I think you kind of forgive it and just hope that you see better from them. We'll forget that happened and say, look, we'll give you one more chance. Come out and show us what you're really capable of. A lot of people had some high hopes for Fremantle this year. Yeah, I'm happy to forgive it, provided they come out and show a lot more this week. Meanwhile, Sydney are 0-2, but in all honesty, they could well be 2-0. So they've played 2 games. They lost by 20 points to Hawthorn, and then they lost by 4 points to Brisbane. both of those games, they've had a uncontested turnover in their back 50 that led straight to a goal. One of those games they lost by less than a kick, so that's a very costly mistake. And the week before, they were, I think, definitely under 10 points down. I can't remember if it was to go whether they were within a kick or not, but they were definitely within 10 points. And they did a costly turnover, kick directly to the opposition, 20 metres out. Hawthorn went back and kicked it, and it kind of just gave Hawthorn that momentum late in that game, and then they kicked a couple more, I think, or at least one more after that. I think it might have been 2 points, the margin, when this turnover happened, so it went out to 8 points, and then they got 2 more, and ended up winning by 20 points, Hawthorn. So 2 games that Sydney definitely were right in and could have won, but they didn't. So now they're in that dangerous spot where they're 0-2. It's not the end of the season. It's not the end of the world. It's a long football season. Brisbane lost their first 3 last year, ended up 5th on the ladder, winning the premiership. Hawthorn last year started 0-5 and 1-6 or something ridiculous. Went on to finish 7th on the ladder and playing finals, and made it to a semi-final. So bad starts to the season are not the end of the world, especially when you look at Sydney, who haven't been thrashed in every game, certainly have had their chances. I'm not writing them off yet. 0-3 starts to look a little bit more difficult, though. And then I think they've got the bye after this week, and then they've got Collingwood in gather round. So this is probably an important game, because if they don't win this one, then they go into the bye 0-3, and all of a sudden that gather round game against Collingwood is huge for the Swans. But it's just, you're going to want 13 plus wins for the season from your 23. So now they need 13 out of 21. Still gives them probably 8 losses for the rest of the season. So it's not doom and gloom, but it's certainly not the start that they wanted from this season. So that's all 8 games. There are 2 byes this weekend. Click the wrong button. Gold Coast and GWS, both expansion clubs. Maybe we won't be calling them expansion clubs anymore, because once Tassie joins the roster, they're going to be the expansion team. But that's a story for another day. So yeah, both Gold Coast and GWS having the bye this weekend. So yeah, that's basically them. Jumping into our next little bit. This is my power rankings going into round 2, 2025. Brisbane stay on top. I can't see a reason to drop them out of first. Obviously, those first 3 were first 3 last week, and they all won, and they all did a decent enough job. Brisbane only just won, but they won, so they stay on top. Geelong were outstanding. They stay second, but potentially move a little bit closer to Brisbane. Hawthorn, they go 2-0, so they're confident, they're happy. So they're going to sit in third. GWS, they start the season 2-0, so they jump up to 4th in the rankings and replace Sydney, who started 0-2. As I said, I'm not writing them off. I still think they're a chance. If they keep losing, they will keep dropping. But at the moment, I've got them 5th. Bulldogs 6th. They moved up 1 spot. Collingwood 7th. They moved up 2, thanks to a really good result. Gold Coast also moved up 2 spots with an outstanding road win. Maybe the best win of the weekend. Port Adelaide lose 3 spots. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, because it's only 1 game for these clubs. But still, you have to move Port Adelaide down a bit after that. Likewise with Adelaide, they moved up 5 spots. I had them pretty low, but that's mainly because last year was pretty bad for them. They've started this year outstanding. They're into 10th if they keep winning. Especially if they win a game in Melbourne against Essendon this weekend, they'll probably keep moving up. Carlton, they lose 3 spots after that loss to Richmond, down to 11. Essendon stay sitting in 12th after an okay game. Fremantle drop 2 spots after a really bad performance. Melbourne, they stay in 14th, but maybe slowly looking a little bit better than that after a decent performance. St Kilda dropped 2 spots. They looked terrible. North Melbourne go up 1 spot. They were pretty solid against the Bulldogs. Richmond go up 1 spot. I thought they were going to be locked into 18th all season long, but they started so well. They go up to 17th. And then West Coast. Oh dear. Might have been the worst performance of the weekend. They dropped 2 spots down to a last. I didn't think we'd see that. But I also don't see them getting out of 18th after this week because they've got a tough challenge for them against Brisbane. We'll jump into my footy tips for the weekend. This is how I have them. This is my official All Aussie Rules footy tips for round 2. We've got Hawthorn by 21 points over Carlton. We've got the Doggies in a nail-biter by 3 points over Collingwood. The Bombers by 9 over the Crows in what is a second upset of the weekend. Port Adelaide by 16 over Richmond. They should be too good. Geelong by 35 points over St Kilda. Brisbane should smoke with the Eagles. I've got them by 51. Melbourne by 19 over North Melbourne. And Fremantle to round out the weekend by 5 points. Our record going into this week is 8 out of 11 after starting 0-3. We've got the last 8. So let's keep that rolling. See how we go this weekend. Let me know in the comments who you're tipping this weekend. 8 games this weekend. Another 8 the following weekend, I think. Or is it 7 next weekend? Anyway, whatever it is. Don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe/follow whatever platform you're watching/listening to this. If you haven't already, head over to the YouTube. Plenty of good content over there. Plenty of good videos, if I do say so myself. So go check them all out. All the social medias, all of that stuff. I appreciate you if you've stuck around and listened this far. There's 2 episodes of the podcast every single week. Mondays and Thursdays. Mondays we wrap up the round. Thursdays we preview the next round. We've got all the good stats for you coming to review on Monday. So come back, check that out. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch us on the next one.